Thank you so much for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you with us. It is a distinct pleasure to finish this fourth year of CLAMS programming with Professor John Haldon. Whom we thank a lot for honoring us, John, and joining us. I'm sure for what is going to be again a very inspiring lecture. I don't think John needs any introduction, but just in case, I have a brief introduction, and then we'll get to John's presentation right away. So Professor John Haldon is a fellow of the British Academy, a corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and a foreign member of the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome. I hope I have not bastardized that. He is currently director of the Princeton University Climate Change, and John, you can tell us that about the move, and History Research Initiative. He is Emeritus Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of European History, Emeritus Professor of Byzantine History and Hellenic Studies, and former director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. From 2006 to 2012, he directed the AFCAT Archaeological Project and Archaeological and Historical Survey in North Central Turkey. His research centers, and this is just a few of the aspects of John's research. His research centers on the socioeconomic, institutional, political, and cultural history of the early Middle Byzantine Empire from the 7th to 11th century. He also works on political system and structures across the European and Islamic worlds from late ancient to early modern times, and of course, the climate project that he's in charge of now, and he has been dealing with for a while now. He has, I mean, he has tens of articles. I mean, if not hundreds. His most recent books are the Thematibus on the themes of Constantine the Seventh, Porphyrogenitus, translated. Did I say that right, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, translated with introductory chapters and notes, which came out in 2021. The Empire That Would Not Die, The Paradox of Eastern Roman Empire, 640 to 740, which came out in 2016 by Harvard. A Tale of Two Saints, The Passions and Miracles of Saints Theodore, the Recruit, and the General, which came out in 2016 in Liverpool. A critical commentary on the Tactita of Leo VI, which came out from Dumbarton Oaks in 2014, and Byzantium in the Iconoclast Era, A History with L. Brubaker, which came out from Cambridge in 2011. It is a distinct pleasure to welcome John. And without any further ado, I think I'm going to give you the platform, Professor Haldon, and we're all ears.
Thank you very much, Parvane. I hope everyone can hear me okay and that you can see the screen, the slides. It's an honor for me to be invited, of course. It's a shame I couldn't be in New York in person. But apparently this series of meetings has been online in its entirety, so maybe there'll be a future occasion. What I want to talk about today is the ways in which, or the problems that face historians who want to try to use paleoclimatic and paleoenvironmental evidence in their history writing. And the issues that we face, both with the methodologies of the scientists whose work we're appropriating, on the one hand, and as well the problems of causality, the connections that we might want to draw between the evidence we have about changes in land use and changes in climate and social and political changes in the world that we're studying. And I'm going to use as my example, for obvious reasons, the Eastern Roman Empire in the period between the end of the 6th and the roughly the beginning of the 11th century. And I'm going to focus in particular on Anatolia because we have a lot of reasonably well dated paleo data from that region. And I'll talk a little bit right at the end, or at least I'll make some allusions to the situation in the Balkans, the southern Balkans in particular, as well. Um, so the let's begin with a sort of brief summary of what we know about the situation of Anatolia. And the first point I think to make is that Anatolia presents a fairly complex climatic regime at every period, with several contrasting patterns of climate, which is a result of a combination of the collision of air masses from the North Atlantic, from the Mediterranean Sea, and from Eurasia together with a widely diverse topography, plateau grasslands, forest, arid desert-like regions, and chains of mountains. And the result is there are basically 7 climatic subregions or subregimes across Anatolia, which result from this combination of factors. Now, paleoclimate and paleoecological data from each of these, even if not always as chronologically refined as we would like, show often very different patterns of warm or cold and arid or moist conditions in these different regions, but at the same times. And since the pattern of change was by no means uniform, either chronologically or spatially, drawing causal associations between climate and the wider social, economic, and political evolution of the period that we're concerned with in these areas is particularly challenging. It is possible to generalize. In the decades around 500 CE, for example, Mediterranean atmospheric circulation experienced some significant changes, with northern, central, and eastern Anatolia and the northern Levant becoming somewhat wetter, whilst other regions, including the Balkans, Greece, and southwest Anatolia, as well as southern Arabia, became a little more arid. But there's a problem with the generalizations that you can see on that particular map, which I'll come to in a moment. Because when we zoom into specific local data, this picture becomes much more complex, a point recently reinforced by Jacobson and others in this important paper, which focuses on the southwest of Anatolia. We now have some pretty well-refined chronologies from several sites in Anatolia and the Balkans for both climatic variation as well as land use for the Byzantine period. So in the following, I want to see to what extent we can connect the data that these sites have produced with with some aspect of the social and economic history of the East Roman Empire between the 6th and 7th and the 10th and 11th centuries. I'll briefly resume now some of the key sources for this information. So we have well-dated speleothem, that's to say cave data from Uzuntaala cave in Thrace, which should come up there. There's at the top. We have good data from Lake Yenicea, which you can see there. We also have good data from Sofola cave. We have good data from Lake Iznik, from down in the south, Kocain cave, from Lake Buldan in the west, and from Lake Na in Cappadocia. And then we have less refined data from a number of other sites like Lake Morgan, Lake Chubuk, Lake Tejer in the east, near to Sevastier or Sivas, and from Lake Churl. And these are all lake bed data, apart from Sofola Cave, Uzuntaala Cave, and Kocain Cave. And the data from these comes from speleothems, that's to say stalagmites and stalactites. And this data on the climatic side, this data is largely drawn through carbonate mineralogy analysis and from isotopic data from carbon and oxygen isotopes. Um, and obviously, it would take up far too much time for me to go through and explain all these. But one of the problems I should briefly allude to is that when we historians and archaeologists start looking at the scientific articles where these data are presented and analyzed, we need to understand the methodologies that the scientists themselves are using if we're to make sensible use of what they've produced. Because quite often there are potential inaccuracies in date, their methodologies we need to understand a little bit about in order to assess how valid the interpretation of the data might be at the end of the day. Um, so, as I said, I don't want to go into too much detail about the evidence from each of these sources for data. But one of the things that is very clear, and I'll summarize them very quickly in a second, is that when we look at the evidence, there's the situation of Uzun, for example, just to the northwest of Istanbul, Constantinople. When we look at these different sources of data, while we can draw a general pattern for what's happening in either Anatolia or in the Balkans over a particular period, within that period and from region to region, there are some significant differences. So, because we can draw at the general level a conclusion about, say, for example, increasing aridity or increasing humidity across the wider region, um, once we start looking at each locality or each subregion, the variations mean that we may not legitimately draw conclusions based on that general pattern, except of the most general sort. And those general conclusions don't really help us very much in trying to understand what's happening historically at local levels. So, for example, the new analyses and the recent recalibration of data from Uzun suggest that from the seventh until the 690s, from the beginning of the seventh till the 690s, it was relatively humid and stable in that part of Thrace. And it was followed by a relatively dry phase, which lasted until 740, and then a subsequent wetter phase that lasted until the first half of the 11th century. And these are very accurate dates. And it has to be said that the degree of accuracy in these dates is the crucial thing. And many of the sites, because there are many more sites from which we have paleo data than the ones I've suggested, many of the sites have a much less refined chronology, and it's impossible to say within 100 years, and sometimes a greater time span, when the particular shift from one situation to another actually occurred. Um, so because I don't want to go on too long with these things, if we look at Sofalar Cave and compare it with the data from Lake Nar, for example, we can see some similarities. And when you take the average or the mean for the data from each of these, you can produce here this sort of graph. But if you look at the thick blue line, that's the mean. But it clearly doesn't represent what's happening in each of those two separate areas. So while at the general level we can draw some conclusions about what's going on, when we look at the specific sub-region, we need to take into account those two rather different um, uh, um, results. Lake Yenichaa, which recently we published something on this at the beginning of this year. The article only came out about 2 weeks ago. We have some very fine, refined data here for olive cultivation as well as climate data. And one of the interesting things about this is that this the picture that we get about the rise and fall of olive cultivation parallels to some extent the archaeological evidence that was assessed and collected by Owen Doonan's CNOP project, in so far as the archaeological evidence indicates a breakdown, if you like, or a collapse in terms of the rural olive cultivation economy of the region in the late part of the 6th and early part of the 7th centuries, and this is confirmed by the pollen evidence for olive um, uh, from the lake. Unfortunately, this is a very simplified and generalized graph, so it doesn't actually show those differences. But you can take my word for it. And if you look at the article by Vignola et al. 2026 in Journal of Quaternary Studies, you'll find this data presented in much more detail. Um, if one looks at the site numbers, and particularly the rural sites, and the curve is indicated by the dotted line there, averaged out over 20-year blocks, you can see the expansion of the olive cultivation or the archaeology associated closely with olive cultivation and the olive economy from the beginning of the 4th century up until the end of the 6th century is a massive expansion and a sudden, fairly catastrophic collapse around about 600. Now, whether this is to do with a slight shift in climate which occurs in the region, indicated in the Sofilar cave data, or whether it's to do with changes in market demand for olive or the disruption of the olive market or economy more generally, is not yet clear. And again, here's an example of a situation where we have a fairly precise paleo-environmental or paleoclimatic signature, but it's very difficult to tie that in causally to the parallel data that we have from the archaeological and in some cases from the historical evidence. Lake Iznik, again, not far from Constantinople, but it gives a somewhat different signature from the data from Uzantala Cave to the north there on the map. And again, those areas aren't really all that far apart in terms of larger weather patterns, but in terms of the local climate signature, there are some important differences. So it's clear that the northern part of what's called the Marmara transition zone is rather different when one graphs its shifts from the southern part of the Marmara transition zone. So again, we need to be careful about what conclusions we draw. One of the things that is clear from the Lake Iznik data also is that there is a very significant fall off in anthropogenic activity, which can be situated in the second half of the 7th century, but no more precisely than that. Is that a result of the constant raids which were mounted by the Arab forces in the period between the 660s towards Constantinople and the siege of 717? That could be the case because one of the indications that Marek Jankowiak has looked at in terms of episcopal attendances at the councils of 680, 681, and also for 692 in Constantinople are the numbers of bishops who actually were able to attend. And what's significant from the map that he drew is that the percentage of bishops coming from the areas through which the Arab armies passed is very much reduced compared with areas which were less heavily affected by warfare. But does the signature from Lake Iznik indicate one of the effects of this, or does it indicate other changes in the market economy of the broader region, which is also equally possible? And of course, it might well be both. There isn't, however, a significant climatic indicator here to suggest that the change is directly caused or attributable to climate. When we go down to Kochain Cave in the south, we find, again, a very different story. And again, I'm going to skip through the details here, but one of the points about this is that the southwest of Anatolia appears to share its climatic regime much more closely with Greece and the South Balkans than it does with the rest of Anatolia. An important point about this, though, is that, again, climate doesn't seem to play a particularly significant, if any, role at all in some of the important historical developments that occurred in this period. So, for example, the rise and flourishing of some of the Hellenic cities and colonies in the southwest actually takes place during a period of very considerable aridity. And yet we have flourishing agriculture. And the whole picture from the Kocain cave record for the southwestern, that southern portion of Anatolia, seems to indicate very little direct interaction between a flourishing economy and flourishing urbanism on the one hand, and any climatic changes or situations. So again, these are significant and important markers, if you like, to warn us about making too many conjectures without adequate evidence about connections between um, climate, land use, and settlement patterns and local economies. Um, Lake Buldan similarly reinforces that picture. The olive picture is the same. Again, I'm not going to go into detail because it gets a bit boring. I'll try and get to the end of this section simply by pointing out that you can see on that graph there it's admittedly somewhat simplified, but nevertheless averaged tendencies for um, northern, central, eastern Turkey or Anatolia on the one hand, and the Balkans and Greece and southwest Turkey on the other. They are inverse versions of one another, in fact. So when it's getting drier and colder in Anatolia, it's actually getting warmer and wetter in the Balkans and Greece. That's not a hard and fast rule, but that seems to be the average picture from the data that we've got at the moment. And you can see, of course, there in the different colors that there are substantial variations within each area at the same time. And again, this is a warning light that we need to take account, very careful account of the highly local as well as the general. I won't discuss in any detail, I'll refer to it, the so-called late antique Little Ice Age, the Lalia, as it's often referred to. Um, but the already complex picture I've just been sketching out has to be further nuanced by the evidence from tree rings and speleothems from the Alps, from Central Europe, and from the Altai Mountains in East Central Asia, because the evidence here indicates, certainly from higher latitudes, from higher elevations rather, indicates colder and drier climate during the first half of the 6th century, marked in particular from the late 530s, and generally agreed now to have been triggered by a major explosive volcanic eruption in the tropics, which made the 540s the coldest decade within the so-called Dark Ages cold period, which stretches from about 450 to about 800, but again with regional variations. The exact impact of these conditions on lowland areas, however, remains to be determined, although there are already some indications from recent work around both Lake Iznik and from Yenichaa that a decline in pollen taxa, indicative of a range of anthropogenic crops, points to a decrease in agricultural activity in both areas. But as I said, it's difficult to know whether this is caused by climate or whether it's a combination of climate and local economic factors or other elements that we don't know much about. Um, Finally, if we look at, oh, yes, I just wanted to show these two slides just to indicate this is the rainfall pattern for today. And in terms of the general picture, that hasn't really changed much over the last 12 to 15,000 years. Um, uh, but these different heights and troughs in terms of annual and seasonal rainfall give you a good indication of how varied the microclimates in Anatolia are. And the same is true then if one maps onto that as well, the temperature variations across the 4 seasons of the year. Um, So I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll come back to all that in a moment when I look at the particular couple of case studies. I want to talk a little bit first about land use and agriculture. And just as a reminder, this slide just gives you an idea of the seasonal variations and the different sorts of conditions required by the various types of crop that were produced both in Anatolia in particular, but also in the Balkans during the late Roman and early medieval or early and middle Byzantine periods. Um, so one important question is the extent to which the paleoecological evidence, especially from fossilized pollens, for example, can help us understand changes in land use and the landscape more widely. And while it's obvious that the differentiating features between anthropogenic and climate-driven impacts is rarely straightforward to locate, in the case of the Byzantine Empire, we actually have a few, but not as many as we'd like, of course, good examples of both. So if we begin at the general for a minute, at the most general level in Anatolia, the pollen data suggested in the course of the 6th and especially from the later 7th century, the classic late ancient agrarian tradition characterized by a mixed regime of vine, cereals, and olive production, um, uh, which dominates around the Mediterranean and Aegean coastal plains and river valleys, receded and was gradually replaced at different rates according to area, either by a more limited range of crops or in some cases by natural vegetation and woodland regrowth. And while the chronology is often poorly refined, there are enough reasonably well-dated data to suggest that while the process started earlier or later in some regions than others, the general shift was focused around the middle of the 7th to the middle of the 8th centuries. This is indicated by a number of proxies across Anatolia, which you can see in this table. And some of the sources of data we've already discussed are there, but there are many others as well. And that gives you a rough idea of what was going on between the 5th and 6th on the one hand and the 9th and 10th centuries on the other, as indicated by the pollen data. And you can see there is substantial change in many regions with a move towards stock raising and cereals, although that, of course, depends on the area and what the traditional economy was before these changes set in, but also some considerable degrees of continuity. And that's important to bear in mind. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute. Um, The pattern suggested by these pollen data, if we look at that, is interesting because there is a very substantial and often dramatic fall off in both of cereals and tree crops as well as grazing weeds sometime between, and it depends where we are for how precise we can be, between the middle of the 7th century and the middle of the 8th centuries, but in some cases beginning a bit earlier, and in some cases ending a little bit later. Um, what's important about these changes is that they do not coincide at all with any changes in climate. So we can say for sure that whatever the cause is, it wasn't changes in the climate that produced these dramatic shifts. And the biggest shifts, as you can see, um, uh, uh, particularly in, say, the south center of Anatolia, and so on the left there, take place in the course of the period between 650 and 750. Of course, it depends on the degree of refinement of our data. These are averaged. We haven't taken into account this is a chart that we produced in 2018. We haven't taken into account new data from Lake Buldan, from Lake Yenichan, one or two other sites here, but they wouldn't, even if we included them, they wouldn't make a big difference to this general picture. However, having said that, go back to what I was talking about earlier. When you look at the pollen signatures for particular regions or particular lakes, then you have a slightly more nuanced picture. So again, to understand what's happening, we need to relate the paleo data from a particular area to the archaeology and the history of that area as far as we can write the history yet, to understand how the bigger picture would actually look if we took all those regional nuances more carefully into account. So again, this is a good indication of some major economic shifts and transformations, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening in each sub-region. One of the interesting things about these changes, though, is that, if I can get to the next slide, is that there is a shift from, as I said, the traditional Mediterranean or East Mediterranean basin more broadly pattern of agriculture towards an emphasis on cereals and particularly livestock. Now, while the absolute numbers decline in all cases, the relative numbers, the relationship or proportionality between stock raising and cereals on the one hand and crops, olive, vine, and so forth on the other, changes. And the emphasis on stock raising and cereals becomes very clear, even though the totals, the absolute numbers, are universally much, much lower. And that's another important feature because that, and particularly the collapse in serial numbers or serial percentages across the board, which is the staple source of food for the populations of the East Roman world, indicates um, uh, a very considerable demographic decline as well. Um, Now, changes such as those that we can see in the pollen record, again, there's no way we can relate this to any climatic shifts, so there must be other reasons. The changes may reflect the choice of the producers themselves. It may reflect choices imposed on them um, by others. Uh, there may be a whole range of purely social and economic reasons why these changes took place. So, assuming we can exclude for this period, which I think we can, shifts in staple dietary habits, there seem to be three possibilities left by which we can explain these shifts. Shifting market demand, pressures from warfare and insecurity, and pressure from a third party, such as a landlord or the state. Um, the changes I'm talking about are the shift in the balance between cereals and stock raising on the one hand and other types of farming outputs. Now, we know that across the 7th century, international markets shrank or changed, local markets redirected their focus, and so demand for a wide range of farming produce must have been impacted. At the same time, inland regions in particular, anyway, became more than ever reliant on highly local relationships and locally produced resources. Many regions were also, of course, negatively impacted by warfare and insecurity well into the 8th century. We have a good example of this with the evidence from Lake Na in Cappadocia, which can be very precisely dated to within 2 to 3 years. Annually laminated varves or annually laminated strata, if you like, from the lake bed can be very accurately dated. And we know that this data can be compared with the historical evidence for what's happening in the area, and the collapse in agriculture around the lake coincides very exactly with the presence over a period of 10 or 12 years of Arab raiding parties who overwintered in the region and ravaged the terrain and drove away the population. And there is, in fact, a complete collapse of anthropogenic activity in that area until the beginning of, or until the middle of the 10th century. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Another reason for changes in the relationship between different types of crop may well have been, and I've argued this elsewhere, to do with what the state needed, what the government needed to maintain its military and indeed to survive. Because by the late 640s, the empire had lost all its wealthy provinces. Egypt, which had produced, these are approximate levels, of course, based on 6th and 5th century evidence, and compared with later Ottoman archival evidence, you can see there the percentages of the annual fiscal income that flowed into the Constantinopolitan fisc in one form or another around about 560. Egypt produced 30%, Greater Syria produced some 25%, and Africa some 12%. Egypt was lost by 642. Syria was lost entirely by the 640s. Sicily was maintained as part of the imperial system until the middle of the 8th century, middle of the 9th century. Africa was lost by the 690s. The point being that within a very short period of 10 years or so, the empire was left only with bits of the Balkans and Anatolia. So it had lost, as you can see there, a huge proportion of its fiscal revenues. So how did it maintain its military? One way to do it was to base the troops, the soldiers, across areas which could support them. And although we don't have exact numbers, and these are guesses, they're sort of intelligent guesses, but they are based on very problematic data. One of the obvious things is that the troops were based according to the ability of the region to support them. And you can see there that what's interesting is that the least wealthy part of Anatolia in the east supported actually the smallest army, whereas the wealthier regions in northwest Anatolia and western Anatolia were able to support much greater forces proportional to the area covered. So part of the restructuring of the imperial military in the 7th and early 8th centuries was not to do with strategic needs, but to do with logistical requirements. Um, Grain was crucial, and if the empire didn't have the resources to support its armies, it wouldn't have survived. So part of the reason for its survival is, of course, its ability to provide cereals to support the troops in the regions where they were based, and in particular to support Constantinople. And of course, by the end of the 7th century, with the loss of Egypt much earlier and the loss of North Africa, it really had to rely on much more local resources. And one of the areas where we can see from the archaeological and the historical data, which it came to depend upon, is the Pontic coast and the hinterland behind the Pontic Alps on the northern Anatolian plateau. And this is where my first case study becomes relevant. This is the small township of Efkaita in north central Anatolia, a little to the south, west by west of Amasya. Of course, it was an important cultural centre for the devotion of Saint Theodore the Recruit, and you can see him with with his big brother, as it were, Saint Theodore the General, in a 10th century ivory. But the important thing about Efkaita is it lies within the region which received in the 7th century a slightly or somewhat increased rainfall. And it's described already by Strabo as an extremely rich cereal producing region. And so Efkaita, I'm not sure what happened there. Efkaita became important not just because of the saint's cult of Saint Theodore and the fact that it was raised to the um, uh, status for bishopric in the early 6th century by Anastasius, but also because it was at the center of a very important grain producing region. And it's referred to on several occasions as a significant military base, even though it's not particularly defensible location. And one of the interesting indications for this is the results of the ceramics survey we conducted between 2007 and 2010, where it becomes very clear that whereas in many sites in that region, as well as in Anatolia more widely, shrank and drew in their horns, as it were. In other words, the regions around them, the suburban regions around them, were no longer cultivated or occupied to the same extent as before. In Efkaita, the reverse seems to be the case. And you can see here the ceramic distribution pattern indicating different functions. These are putative, of course, because the archaeology wasn't always entirely clear. But in terms of sherd density and so forth, as well as sherd types, we could see that in the early and middle Byzantine periods, there is a good deal of continuity of occupation and functional use um, around the township, which goes against the pattern found elsewhere. And you can just briefly compare those three graphs from a number of sites in three different parts of Asia Minor, which indicate that. And what's interesting is that similar to Efkaita, the little Hellenistic port of Agialos, modern Gide, on the coast similarly appears to have prospered during, or at least not to have declined to the same extent during this Dark Age period. And so I think there are some interesting things going on there which cannot be connected with climate, but which can be indicated by or can be reflected in some of the pollen data and the historical and archaeological evidence at the same time. Um, when we move a little bit forward into the 10th century, we have a different problem because there we have a very clear recovery of agriculture, but an agro-pastoralist economy in the middle of the 10th century. And the data from from Nargolu, Lake Na, is again very refined, very chronologically precise. And we can see that around about 955, there is a sudden resurgence or reappearance of anthropogenic activity and farming in the area. Now we know from historical accounts that a substantial estate called Drizion had been brought back into cultivation by we don't know whom, possibly private landlords, but by the 960s it was an imperial estate, which, and we know about it because it was usurped temporarily by an imperial courtier. It was when the Emperor Nikephoros II marched through this estate on his way south to fight against the Emir of Tarsus. Um, he found this estate had been occupied and taken over and run by this imperial courtier. It was taken back under imperial control again during the reign of the subsequent Emperor John I Tsimiskis around about 971. But the point is that this is an area which had been effectively economically recolonized, and that's part of a general recolonization process at this period in this part of Asia Minor and further to the east, which reflects both imperial expansionism and the success of the imperial armies. But it also happens to coincide with this relatively significant improvement in local climate conditions. So again, one has to ask oneself which came first. Is it imperial expansion and the rise to prominence of the military aristocracy in Asia Minor, along with the state? Or is it the impact on local agricultural communities and landlords of improved climate conditions, or a combination of the two? That's the location of Drizion there, the episcopsis, the imperial estate. Why did I put that one there? Oh, I think it was because the shift in the pollen signature for olive also reflects to some extent this change in conditions to the west. This is somewhat to the west, Buldan Yayla, I showed you on the map earlier, which also reflects this slight change. You can see on the far left of the chart there where the year 950 increased charcoal, which indicates human activity in terms of land clearance and so forth, but also a bump upwards in pollen output. So the point of all this is really simply to note that when we compare these broader climate signatures across a wider region, you can see there in a very general way some parallels in the movement of the indicators for humidity and aridity. But at the same time, within each of those indicators, there are substantial local variations in from the point of view of the big picture. They coincide enough for us to draw some general conclusions about conditions across a much wider area. But when we try to relate these to what's happening on the ground and to the local archaeology and history, it's much more complex because we have to take into account these minor fluctuations as well. So really what I wanted to do in this presentation, and I hope I haven't gone on for too long, is simply to point out that this data is invaluable. It's very important. As historians and archaeologists, we need to know, however, how it's generated. What are the methodological problems that the scientists themselves face in analyzing their data? Firstly, and then secondly, in terms of historical analysis, how do we generate causal connections between the archaeological data, the historical evidence, and the various types of paleoscientific evidence that we might want to bring together. Um, and so I guess this talk was aimed really as a sort of warning signal to say this is really important material, but be careful how we use it. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Uh, Parvana, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John, for that very interesting interventionist um, sort of presentation, and it especially the warning that you give about the general versus the local. Is very very intriguing. But I would like to open the platform to questions and answers from colleagues, and you know, colleagues, you can just raise your hand perhaps, and then come to the floor and speak. And Malek, if I cannot see who has raised their hands, please, I can see one already. Please remind me. Robert, please. Thank you for being here. Come up.
So I'm out and about. So nice to go for a walk listening to John in my ear. Fantastic talk, John. I have two questions. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Yeah, good. One, so what you wisely counsel against broader connections, but I expect you know there's appears to be a very solid evidence for a decline in viticulture in late antique Negev. Would you want to or not put that in with your fascinating, really, conclusions about changes in agriculture up in Anatolia? The other quick question was, you didn't mention the P word, the plague, and you did mention about drop in demographic demand could make a difference. Would you want to factor that in, or did you deliberately keep it separate? I mean, I realize you were talking about climate, so you might have wanted to. Thanks, anyway.
No, thank you, Robert. Good question. So I'll deal with plague first. So yes, I mean, in fact, when I was talking about the NHR data and the data from Uzuntaler cave in Thrace, where we have indicators for demographics, they can't be tied in very precisely to the 542 or 540 outbreak, excuse me. But there clearly are reasons to think that the sort of decline that we're seeing in the 7th century may well reflect the impact of a pandemic disease of some sort. And that's something which I think needs to be discussed. At the moment, people are focusing far too much, I think, on the first outbreak and how to interpret the literary sources as well as the archaeology and the ancient DNA data. But in fact, if we look at the bigger picture across the 150 or so years, I think there are connections to be made. It's just that we need to frame those connections in the appropriate local circumstances, as well as in the bigger picture. But it seems to me it can't be right to say that the plague had no impact. It must have had an impact. My suspicion is, and what little evidence we have at the moment would, I think, support this idea, is that the plague had a substantial impact in large cities. It had far less impact in the countryside, but there are going to be exceptions to both rules. So we know, for example, from a hagiography, I know hagiographies are problematic, but nevertheless, they're meant to be believed by the people who listened to them. There's some good evidence from the later 6th, early 7th century from Southern Asia Minor of the significant difference between a town which has been struck by the plague and the countryside around it, which hasn't been affected by the plague at all. And the anxiety of the country people that the plague shouldn't affect them is made manifest in the hagiography. Now, even if the hagiography were a fiction, as it were, it would still make the point that that's something that people are aware of. And so I think our data clearly reflects substantial demographic change, and disease has to be taken as part of that picture. It's just a question of factoring it in at the right level.
Yeah.
On the question, yeah, sorry, Robert, go on.
No, I just going to agree. But yeah, no, if you have comments on the Negev one, that's great actually, 'cause that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, so with the Negev one, there are currently, as you know, there's a huge argument between the two sides about whether the Negev sort of economy collapsed earlier or later, and the evidence, as far as I can tell, suggests that the economy doesn't collapse as early as we used to think. And that using irrigation and various other techniques, cultivation or farming at least continues to function well beyond this sort of earlier collapse period, which was the late 6th and early 7th century. I confess I haven't got that data to hand, and the last time I did any work on this was a couple of years ago. But I'm inclined always to want to query climate as a single factor reason for anything, particularly when we consider that human societies have often flourished in areas which were remarkably unpleasant. When the population learned how to manage their environment, they often flourished. And so I would want to be very careful. I'm not sure if you saw the work that I did with Dominic Flightman and his team on the speleothem data from Oman, where we have a very precise date for an extraordinarily powerful drought, which can be dated more or less precisely to between 522 and 525. And the scientists wanted to say this led directly to the collapse of the kingdom of Himyar and subsequently to the rise of Islam. And as a historian, I had to say that just doesn't work for me. I think the drought certainly exacerbated internal conflict within Himyar, which we know existed, not just between Christians and Jews on the one hand, but also between factions of the Himyarite elite, beginning back in the 450s and even earlier, possibly. But it also would have weakened Himyar with respect to the invasion of the Ethiopians in the 520s. So I can see that the drought must have had a significant impact in lots of different ways. But the kingdom of Himyar survives even under Ethiopian sort of rule until the 560s quite effectively, and conducts campaigns recovering its authority over Central Arabian groups until the 550s at least. So drought, again, I think plays a role. But in each case, we have to take it on its own merits and look at the local context rather than making assumptions, which some people have done, that it always brings a significant negative.
Yep, great. Thanks, John. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
So there is a message from Simone Pierre that says, thanks a lot for your presentation,
I can
Professor.
read it.
You can read it yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, come up, Simone.
Yeah.
Let
I
us.
just tried.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I-
So
Thank you very much, Professor. I was trying to summarize in my head all the graphs, very interesting graphs you showed, and I think maybe I understood stuff that in the southwestern Anatolia, which have a Mediterranean cultural system, there is a drop or decline or collapse even already since the 4th, 5th century. And to the contrary, the northwestern region, the Marmara region and Paphlagonia is more has a better continuity in agriculture. Is it because there had already cereals and livestock as it is the normal agricultural system later? And is if this collapse does uh, indeed exist in the southwestern Anatolia, is it more significant that the collapse in the central Cappadocia region due to Arab Muslim raids?
Okay, thanks. So I think the first thing to say is when you talk about collapse, are you talking about the indications all on the same graph or
No,
separately?
I tried to I tried to read several graphs and make a picture in my head. So maybe my
Okay.
picture is completely wrong.
No,
This is
not
the question.
necessarily. Not necessarily. I think the first thing to say is that the chronology for the drop in cereal production, for example, as well as tree crops, um, for some regions is actually quite it's what's the right word? It's quite crude. In other words, it's not particularly refined. For some areas, it's extremely precise. And so those general graphs, as I said, showing the drop in this late 6th into the 8th century of all the different crops, are a little bit misleading insofar as while they indicate this general process, from region to region and within regions, there are variations. Um, and so using the word collapse, I think, is probably slightly misleading. It's probably my fault. I shouldn't use it. It's not a word I like because it misrepresents the often much more gradual processes that we compress into a single graph. Um, in the case of the data from Lake Nar, we can say for certain, or almost for certain, that the collapse of anthropogenic activity, in other words, the effective disappearance, at least in the pollen signature, the effective disappearance of human farming is a result of warfare. There are no other possible reasons or causes for it because it happens in a very precisely datable way at exactly the right time, indicated in the sources Syriac, Armenian, and Byzantine for and later Arabic accounts, but they're less reliable for the presence of raiding parties who devastated the landscape over a long period of time, year after year after year. For the other regions, I think there are two things. I think you mentioned one. Depending on where we are in Anatolia or in the Balkans, for example, agropastoralism was already a standard farming sort of economy. And so not everywhere, particularly in Central Asia Minor, shared this traditional um, Mediterranean economy, the tripartite economy of olive, vine, and cereals. So the balance between them again varies depending on where we are. Coastal regions and inland valleys, which are well watered, tended to favour obviously the tree crops and the marketable crops of olive and vine, whereas plains regions um, uh, would be less hospitable for those in any case, and so agropastoralism would have been the norm. The point I was trying to make, though, was that agropastoralism seems to become the norm far more widely after the middle of the 7th century and expands at the cost of the other traditional farming economies. And I didn't go on to say this because I didn't have time. That applies to parts of the Balkans as well. Um, uh, in Anatolia, where these collapses can't be dated precisely, I think we have to bear in mind that there may well be other causes, and one of them has to be shifts in markets in the late 6th century onwards. The changes that really impact the East Roman world that become very obvious by the later 7th, early 8th centuries had already begun before the Arab Islamic conquest. And I think they, to a large extent, exacerbated pre-existing tendencies. So those charts or graphs may well represent something which was, excuse me, already going on. And that's why I'm saying that we need to focus much more on each locality to find out what exactly the situation was before the changes that we can see. But it also means that until we get much more precisely datable paleo data from pollen analysis as well as on climate, it's not going to be helpful for us to try to rely just on that paleoscientific evidence. We need to keep working at our archaeology and our historical sources. Does that answer the question? Or to some extent, anyway.
Yes, yes, very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Karim Ali, would you like to come up and pose your question?
Yeah, sure. My
Okay.
question is what's the relationship between the Byzantine Empire's sort of like political struggles with itself and its neighbors in the 11th century and its agricultural economy? Because I've just hearing your presentation and like other stuff I've read, it seems like their agricultural economy was recovering a lot during this period, but they seem to be like faltering militarily and politically as well.
Okay, so the first thing is that this is an interesting period from the 11th to the early 13th centuries. The empire actually goes through a period of um, uh, more negative climate change, and yet at the same time, this clearly doesn't impact its fiscal income or the wealth of the elite. And there was a very good article published in 2016 by historians and climate scientists, showing that the empire's sort of flourishing economy in the 11th and 12th centuries, leaving aside the political and military situation for the minute, clearly wasn't affected by negative shifts in temperature and rainfall. And that's an important point to bear in mind. That is that we probably overestimate negative climate impacts on farming communities unless they really are significant, extreme, and continuous. In other words, repeated over many years. So short-term shifts are expected. I mean, farmers expect short-term shifts, but if you have a drought 3 years in a row, then clearly that's going to massively impact how you can continue. Going back to the politics and the military, I think one has to some extent to disconnect the economy of the empire from its, if you like, its political behaviors and the role of its elites. And one could even argue counterintuitively that the more successful the elite were in exploiting an expanding economy, the more likely they were to kick against state attempts to manage them in terms of fiscally keeping a bigger share of the wealth generated. On the military side, I don't really see, apart from a few silly and incompetent military leaders, I don't really see much change in the efficacy and relative ability of the East Roman armies to look after themselves until we get into the later 1050s and early 1060s. So right up until the end of the reign of Constantine Monomachos, I would largely see the empire as doing a pretty good job of defending its territories and continuing to expand even in some places. Which doesn't mean to say that there weren't idiot generals, and some of them were emperors as well. Romanos III, for example, clearly a total incompetent. And battles that could have been easily won were lost or thrown away. That's always a problem of empires when they're at their height. They underestimate the enemy at all times. I'm not drawing any parallels with what's happening today, but this is what happens. And unfortunately, in the Byzantine case, I wrote an article a while ago about something I call imperial arrogance, which is where when an imperial elite begins to think it can't lose, and it throws itself into situations which it suddenly discovers it can't really extract itself from. And this happens and has happened to virtually every imperial system you can think of in the past, and there's no reason why it will change in the present or the future. But I think the connection between an economy and the political performance of a state needs to be nuanced. And a flourishing economy doesn't necessarily mean a flourishing political system or a successful military, although it can also mean that as well. So it depends on the situation, the conjuncture, if you like. And it also depends on geography and other factors as well.
Well, thank you, John.
You're muted.
Yeah, again. Thank you very much, John. There are so many colleagues that I hope would come up and join the conversation. Alistair is there, for instance. Arietta is there. Yeah, so Joel is there. Johannes is there. Well, everybody on the Patrick is there. So
I think probably people have had enough by now. We could draw things to a close.
I doubt that, but okay. So I pose one question, John. There has been a lot of talk about the Arab conquest of Mesopotamia and Iran, as you know, and the climatic conditions. And so how and sometimes it's posed as a major sort of cause. How do you see that?
Frankly, I don't at the moment see any reason to think that climatic factors played a role, to be honest. I think that, I mean, one needs to think about specifics. So, for example, if during a crucial campaign, for example, a particular climatic anomaly can be shown to have taken place of one sort or another, then perhaps you could build that into your explanation. But we don't really have any evidence of that at all. We don't really have any indications that military campaigning was affected by climatic contexts, which people were not used to. Where you can bring geography and climate into the picture more broadly, but it's nothing to do with climate change, is whether or not an invader has the appropriate sort of cultural resources to deal with different sorts of climatic conditions. And so, for example, if one looks at the sorts of soldiers who were recruited by the Umayyads to fight in Anatolia in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, were not used to Anatolian winters. There is a reason why the Arabs were never able to get a foothold in Anatolia. Some of it's political, some of it's socio-cultural, some of it's to do with the grip that the East Roman state was able to maintain over its elites, who in turn were able to maintain a similar grip over the local populations and can maintain a resistance. But it's also the case that farming and agricultural life and the economy of the region wasn't one with which the soldiers and the camp followers and others who were involved in those raids were entirely familiar or comfortable with. That can't be the only explanation, but it seems to me it's a reasonable point to make. I discussed this with Michael Cook and with Hugh Kennedy a long time ago, and they both agreed that you can't use that, you can't have that sort of cultural climate determinism as an explanation, but it must contribute to some extent to the failure of the Arabs to actually put down any roots in Anatolia ever, even when they tried. And then contrast it with the Seljuk or the Turkmen arrival, where coming from a culture which was entirely comfortable in a steppe environment, Central Asia Minor very quickly fell to the Turkmen. And again, it's an uncomfortable parallel in some ways, and it's not a particularly fair one to make for lots and lots of reasons, historical and cultural. But the short answer to the question is, do I think climate had any role to play in the success of the Arab Islamic conquest? At present, and I might be proven wrong, at present I can't see any reason to think that, frankly.
There's the case that in Azerbaijan, for instance, at the time of the Arab conquest and further on during the Abbasid period, where the Arab efforts to impose an imperial sort of structure on top of the local political structure of the region, that one of the reasons that, for instance, Babak's uprising, Babak Khurramdin's uprising took such a long time, almost like decades, more than 2 decades, to be put down, is that during the winter seasons, Azerbaijan was almost practically sort of impassable.
Yeah, but that's weather rather than, I mean, seasonal, unless the argument is that during that period there's a climate shift towards unusually cold decades, then I don't think that, I mean, one could make the same argument about the Byzantine attempt to destroy the Paulicians in Central Asia Minor, only a little bit after Babak. I mean, in the sort of 850s to 870s. It's very similar, high plateau, central plateau mountain region with vicious winters, hot, dry summers. The Byzantines were unable to put the Paulicians down effectively, but it wasn't because of the weather, it's because of the politics and the military and a whole range of other things that played a role. So no, I want to be, even though I've done a lot of work and been pushing efforts to work in sort of collaborative teams between scientists, archaeologists, and historians, I'm very opposed to sort of any sort of climate determinism of that sort. I think in the longer term, one can see significant impacts, but the short-term things, such as the Arab invasions, happened in a decade, basically. I mean, in 2 decades, 3 decades, the first Islamic Empire was born, and there's no significant climate changes anywhere in the whole Islamic world that would have impacted on that at all. I know there are a couple of articles, I can't remember the names of the authors, by a Russian colleague and a couple of others about 20 years ago, which argued that maybe climate played a role. But the other point is that when we talk about an area becoming more or less arid, we have to say, what do we mean by more or less? I mean, what are the absolutes here? If it's a degree, then it's not really going to have a big effect, except on a few crops here or there. If it's several degrees, then obviously that could be catastrophic. So we need to be able to measure what we mean by more or less arid. And at the moment, we're not in a position to do that, except where we have very clear extremes indicated by the evidence. So, for example, the Omani drought indicated by the speleothem that indicates this very intense drought in the early 6th century. That's enough to indicate some changes. And yet, the archaeology of Yemen hasn't shown up any significant collapse of that mountain irrigation system in the mountains that run down the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Um, so I think there's, basically we need to do a lot more work.
Mm.
And at the moment, we've got enough evidence to make us interested and excited about the potentials.
Mm.
But we are, in some cases, and I'm guilty of it too, perhaps trying to draw prematurely firm conclusions from evidence which isn't really complete.
Mhm. Mm.
I've just talked myself out of a job, but never mind.
No.
So,
That's you're funny. So John, this was like a very fascinating and very mind-probing, and as I said, quite interventionist in a good way, presentation. You have honored us with your presence and with your presentation here. And I was just wondering whether or not, if you have, okay, this is very uncommon to ask from presenters, but if you care to share one of your recent articles, if you have handy with the colleagues here.
do you mean send a link or
Yeah,
talk about it?
uh, well, you could talk about it if you want.
No, I could. I think people have heard enough of me for today.
Okay,
I'm
okay,
happy to. I'll send you some PDFs or a link to a couple of items, and then you can circulate to the group
okay,
and
sure,
those who would like
sure,
to read them can read them.
sure,
That might be better, I think.
sure. Um,
Okay.
So thank you so much, John, for an excellent presentation. Um, and thank you for joining us. And
Thank you.
I'm sure everybody agrees with me that it was a pleasure to hearing you. Um, and once again, you honor us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye bye. Thanks to all for coming and listening. Bye bye.
Yeah.